Now that Dawntrail has been released, we have a higher level cap, new abilities, and more challenges than ever before for those fresh level 100 Scholar players that are looking to better understand their job and how to play it effectively, test themselves in the 7.x series Extremes, Savages, and Ultimates, or even just get rid of healer anxiety so that you can make your roulette queues quick and painless. This is the guide for you. I've been playing healer in this game for a decade with multiple expansions worth of world race experience under my belt, and I'm hoping that at some point during this guide there will be at least a couple of things that I can impart that you didn't already know. I'll be covering your level 100 opener and damaging rotation, how to heal effectively in all types of content, how to triage a group when things go wrong, and how to create healing and mitigation plans. There will be chapters throughout this video to allow for easy navigation because I know this is quite heavy in duration, so please make liberal use of them if you need to. There will also be a lot more experienced and active healers that are only really interested in the openers and rotation section, so I've put those right at the start for that reason. Get whatever is valuable from this guide and then I totally understand. Your goal as a healer is to 1. Keep the party alive, and 2. Deal as much damage as possible whilst fulfilling the requirements of number 1. Scholar is the first of the barrier healers currently accessible in Final Fantasy XIV, having been around since A Realm Reborn first released in patch 2.0. Scholar summons a fairy ally to aid them in battle, making use of their Aetherflow and their fairy's abilities to provide health and support to the party. Scholar has the highest overall AoE shielding potential of all of the game's healers, able to utilize their deployment tactics to negate even the largest incoming attacks. Effective Scholar play often revolves around using combinations of their OGCD healing abilities to deal with incoming damage, and then leaning on their powerful shields to prep for the heavier hits. Managing Aetherflow and developing a balance between utilizing them for damage and healing is also key. The fairy will passively heal whichever party member is lowest on HP during encounters. One thing to remember as a healer is that your job is not to immediately heal damage as soon as it comes out. That is not your goal. Instead, your goal is to take a proactive approach and look towards the next instance of damage and ensure that your party has enough HP or effective HP to survive that before it comes along. Scholar has options like Whispering Dawn, Seraphism, and their passive fairy healing to enable this. Healers don't exactly have much of an in-depth or strict rotation to follow thanks to their relative simplicity, so usually their burst windows are very free-flowing and your main goals are just to keep GCD uptime and fit all of your heavy hits within those buffs. In your case, this is just timing change stratagem correctly, hitting Baneful Impaction, and getting off as many energy drains as you safely can, as well as refreshing your dot before those buffs drop. Let's look at your level 100 openers first. Your opener is going to look a little bit like this. You're going to precast Broil 4 to go off as the pull begins. Then you're going to weave in your potion and immediately Biolysis into Dissipation, cast another Broil, use Chain Stratagem, and begin dumping your Aetherflow stacks as energy drains. Once you've used all 3, press Aetherflow, followed by Baneful Impaction, of course making sure to weave each of these between broils, and continue dumping your freshly regenerated Aetherflow stacks. If you need Aetherflow stacks for healing within the first minute, just skip 1, 2, or 3 off the end of the opener. That's totally fine. As buffs are about to end, you will want to refresh your dot early to catch the end of them. In progression situations, I honestly recommend you hold on to at the very least 1 stack for safety purposes, but once you're a bit more confident you don't need to, feel free to get rid of them under raid buffs. The first question I'm expecting you're going to ask is, why would you Dissipation first as standard? And it's linked partly due to the extension of raid buffs, with them all being 20 seconds now. This means that you'll much more consistently be able to fit more energy drain stacks under buffs, and as long as you don't neglect your Baneful Impaction or healing responsibilities in doing so, the more the better. What using Aetherflow second allows you to do is carry over any leftover stacks from your odd minute windows into those Chain Stratagem enhanced 2-minute hits. Use them, then hit Aetherflow without delay, and get as many of those off as you safely can as well. This means that if you don't need the stacks for healing, you can hit 6 energy drain stacks in every 2-minute window, and Aetherflow will line up naturally to do so from there on out because you set it up to do so within your opener. You're also getting your fairy downtime out of the way as quickly as possible whilst there are no major mechanics happening. Your fairy will be back sooner and ready to Whispering Dawn the inevitable raid-wide damage on full. Despite that, there will be encounters where you want to use something akin to this instead, where you swap Dissipation and Aetherflow around and use Aetherflow first. This will mostly be used in encounters where you would not end up being provided ample time to get off and use your 3 Aetherflow charges before the enemy dies, but you're really, really close. Make sure that you always keep in perspective the relative value of Energy Drain. It only deals 100 potency of damage, so all 3 stacks are only slightly stronger than a single broil cast. As a result, you always opt to sacrifice Aetherflow stacks on healing rather than GCDs if you have a choice. There will also be moments, especially during progression, that you don't feel safe dispelling the fairy for 30 seconds. In those cases, skip the Dissipation entirely and consider it the cost of doing business as a safety gamer. Scholar's DPS rotation is incredibly simple at its core. Your standard rotation will consist of refreshing your damage over time ability every 30 seconds, and in between you'll use your filler DPS skill, Broil 4. Every 60 seconds, you can press Aetherflow, which will provide you 3 Aetherflow stacks. You can then use these Aetherflow stacks on important heals like Sacred Soil and Indom, or burn them as energy drains for a small damage boost. Remember, your goal is to always use Aetherflow on cooldown unless in very, very specific and also very niche circumstances, partially because Aetherflow ties into your healing, but it also ties into both your damage and your mana economy, so it's kind of the core of your kit, and as a result, you plan around spending all 3 of those Aetherflow stacks that you obtained before the next Aetherflow comes off cooldown. Every 2 minutes, you want to use Change Stratagem, your raid buff, in line with the rest of your party's buffs, and make sure you hit Baneful Impaction within those buffs, alongside as many energy drains as you safely can. Every 3 minutes, Dissipation will provide you 3 extra Aetherflow stacks at the cost of losing access to your fairy for 30 seconds, as well as being locked out of key healing tools like Seraphism. When you need to move places fast, you can use Ruin 2 to allow you to do so, while still dealing respectable amounts of damage to your foe. Art of War is your AoE damage dealing tool, and you use it as your filler skill instead of Broil at 2 or more targets. Biolysis is your dot, lasting for 30 seconds. In general, you want to apply it immediately as an encounter begins, and reapply it just as it's about to drop, preferably when it has 0 to 2 seconds remaining. I want to make a note here that during your opener, this rule is twisted just a little bit, because you refresh the dot a little bit early in order to catch the end of raid buffs, but from that point onwards, you will refresh it as late as possible. It is instant cast, so you can also use it in order to double weave and make an extended free movement. If an enemy is about to die or become untargetable in the near future, bear in mind that the dot needs to be active for 15 or more seconds in order to be a damage gain over your filler. In between that, you use Broil 4. It has a base 1.5 second recast, meaning you can single weave an instant afterwards and make a small 1 second movement for free. Change Stratagem increases crit rate on a target for 20 seconds, then allowing you to combo your new OGCD Baneful Impaction off of it. Baneful Impaction is an AoE dot lasting 15 seconds, dealing 700 potency of damage across its duration. Assuming you get it to last for at least half of its duration, which is really easy to do, it is your strongest hit. Always get this off, and always under raid buffs. You gain Aetherflow stacks from both Aetherflow and Dissipation, meaning if you use them on cooldown, you will get 12 stacks every 3 minutes. These can either be used on essential heals or on 100 potency energy drains. Energy drain is very low potency, so these are not your main priority by any means, but when you can safely do it, you should. And to make it clear, what I mean by when you can safely do it, I'm referring to the fact that if you use an energy drain now, and that means that later down the road in that 1 minute cycle, you will have to do a GCD heal to accommodate for that fact, that energy drain wasn't worth it. You only use an energy drain when you know it will not cost you a GCD heal later in your 1 minute cycle. For movement phases, you can rely upon Ruin 2. It's instant cast, but is a 90 potency loss from a broil, so you need to weigh up when it's worth it. Art of War 2 is your filler AoE DPS skill. It's a gain at 2 or more targets, and in those situations, you will use it instead of Broil. It's an instant cast, and the attack is located on yourself. One situation in which you may gain value from using Art of War on single target is when a mechanic requires a specific player facing occurs, such as a gaze mechanic or like the monitor mechanic in the Omega Protocol Ultimate. If you do not have a swift cast or extremely confident timing in order to cover the snapshot of the mechanic, Art of War is instant and does not turn your player character, so you can position correctly and use that instead. You still lose damage in comparison to the riskier option of broiling, or even Ruin 2 and then facing away, but it's better than doing nothing at all. Lucid Dreaming is a key part of your kit, and you should make sure you press it early and often. I usually use Lucid somewhere around the end of my opener, and then on cooldown from that point onwards. Keeping a healthy mana economy is really important, and you should do something similar to this. If you ever drop below 9k MP and your Lucid is available to use but you haven't pressed it, make that your priority. Lastly, and something players shouldn't neglect in my opinion, are auto attacks. It's free damage, even if it is only a tiny amount. On Scholar, I think you hit for 100 to 150 per auto attack. Remember that on healers, you need to manually turn on auto attacks each time you move into melee range after disconnecting. The DPS gain is minuscule, but it's something, and it's a good lesson in positional awareness. Funnily enough, Scholar is also the one healer with auto attacks that are even worth considering. Astro and White Mage are both locked to 1 damage auto attacks, and Sage autos are kind of pathetic in comparison to the 100 plus damage Giga Chads that Scholar can put out. It's probably worth going back to Caster 101 for a moment to discuss weaving, just in case, before we move a little more in depth. When you press a button marked as a spell on Disciples of Magic, you'll see it and all the other spells spin on your hotbar. This is the global cooldown, or GCD. The base GCD time in Final Fantasy XIV is 2.5 seconds. Whilst your GCD is rolling, you can't use another until it finishes spinning. Anything marked as an ability does not cause your GCD to roll upon using it, meaning it is off the global cooldown and is referred to as an OGCD. As long as you aren't currently casting or animation locked, you can use an OGCD, regardless of if your GCD is still rolling or not. This is called weaving. After using a spell which is an instant cast like Ruin 2 or Biolysis, you can weave up to 2 OGCDs afterwards. You can do your GCD, then press 2 buttons like Whispering Dawn and Recitation, and they both go off before my GCD has finished spinning and is ready to go again, and I can continue to press the next one without delay. When it comes to casted spells, like say let's look at Broil 4 as an example, so when you look at the tooltip, Broil 4 is listed as having a 1.5 base cast, but a 2.5 second recast. This means that the GCD is 2.5, but the cast itself is 1.5. As a result, after your cast is finished, you have a 1 second window to use an OGCD, move, or anything else you like before you aim to press your next GCD. As a little note, your base cast and recast are both affected by the spell speed stat. That's why yours is probably looking a little bit different to mine. If you need to do healing GCDs, that is absolutely fine. They just replace a broil. And if you need to do instant OGCD healing abilities such as Indom or Sacred Soil, your aim is to always weave them with no clipping. Scholar has a fairy pet, which will aid them in combat, providing passive heals to the lowest HP member of the party and enabling a large percentage of the player's healing tools. You want to summon your fairy pre-pull and keep it up persistently, instantly resummoning if you die and need to be raised for any reason. All fairy heals are OGCDs. You'll likely notice that in many cases there is a little delay on their casting. This is because the fairy is doing their own GCDs in the form of embraces on party members, mainly the tank, and when you execute a fairy skill, it won't interrupt its current cast to do so, it will wait until the next one, then carry out your chosen action. You also have a number of actions to dictate the placement and general AI of your fairy. Away makes the pet leave, heal makes it follow you, place puts it in a very specific position of your choice, stay makes it stay, guard makes it refrain from attacking until you do, and steady makes it wait for further orders. I'm going to be 100% real. You can ignore most of these. In fact, I don't even have half of them on my hotbars. I have place, heal, and away. That's literally it. And really, you're not going to use away almost ever. Place can be pretty handy when you're dealing with mechanics that split the group. You can position the fairy in the middle of the room to ensure that your heals will hit the whole party even when you're far away, and it's also useful to prevent your heals being delayed or interrupted by the fairy following your movement. When you want your fairy to resume following you, just hit heal once more. This is the only real fairy micro you need to care about nowadays for general purpose gameplay, otherwise you can just let them do their thing. One thing to bear in mind is that the potency of pet abilities is actually a little funky compared to those that originate from the player. As in, they only deal about 90% of the effective healing per potency compared to that which a healer can put out. So 100% potency from a fairy is probably only worth about 90-ish in a real-world raid setting, compared to 100 potency from a player spell. There is no way around this, and it isn't a big problem whatsoever, but it's something to bear in mind for when your heal feels a little weaker than you're expecting it to be. We've talked a lot about damage, so let's pivot and cover the other aspect that is core to good Scholar play: effective healing. Instead of seeing damage and thinking, okay, I need to heal that, in general, what you want to be doing is always thinking ahead, like I mentioned before. I'm going to split Scholar's heals into 3 categories as we run through them: free heals, Aetherflow heals, and emergency heals. Free heals are those that are damage neutral or positive. These are the heals that are your first port of call, the core tools in your arsenal, and you want to make use of them liberally and regularly to keep the party safe. When you are planning your heals, you will generally be using these good heals, quote unquote, in the vast majority of situations. After that are your Aetherflow heals, which cost you 100 potency of damage to use if you don't have Recitation available. But they are still really good and absolutely should be used very often. Remember how little, relatively speaking, 100 potency is. Then you have your emergency heals. These are considered a less than ideal scenario because they'll reduce your damage, but in the words of a great and revered scholar, it is what it is. These heals are powerful and useful, and at times you will rely on them. Understanding when to fall back on them and where their strengths lie is incredibly valuable, and you shouldn't discount them just because you sacrifice damage to cast them. Remember, your first goal is to keep the party alive. Damage comes second. First off, let's look at the free heals. You have Whispering Dawn, an AoE regen, Fey Blessing, a relatively weak AoE heal, Fey Illumination, which increases healing magic potency and also offers 5% mitigation to the party, Recitation, which allows you to use an Aetherflow heal for free, at least some of the options that is, guaranteeing them to crit as well. Excog and Indom are the Aetherflow heals in question, and they are both very useful, so this is one of your best cooldowns. Whilst you can also use it to buff GCD healing, such as Adlo or Consultation, I generally reserve that for extremely planned instances. You also have Summon Seraph, temporarily upgrading your fairy into Seraph and letting you use Consolation twice, which are free AoE shields. This also upgrades the passive fairy heals from Embrace into Seraphic Veil whilst it's active, making them apply shields. Dissipation also technically strengthens your GCD heals and is free, but it locks you out of almost every single heal in this list for 30 seconds in exchange. Usually this doesn't cost you too heavily, but occasionally you will hold Dissipation for this reason if the fight damage incentivizes it. Lastly, you have your level 100 ability, Seraphism. Seraphism is a very multifaceted ability, so please bear in mind that the AoE regen component of it that I'm mentioning here is the only really free part, and that we're going to talk about it more later. Do note that when you're using Seraph, your Fey Illumination and Whispering Dawn will change into Seraphic versions. Functionally, they don't change at all, it's just a fresh coat of paint. You also have Protraction, a single target OGCD which increases max HP by 10%, it also heals that 10%, and also increases the healing recovery, and you have Expedient as well, which provides a passive damage mitigation and increased movement speed for the party for a little while. I want to make an individual note about Recitation here. I covered it briefly before, but it is, in my view, one of the strongest tools in your entire kit, and it's the one of the above list that I want to discuss in more depth. Recitation is a 60-second cooldown and allows you to use Indom, your AoE heal, and Excog, your most valuable tank sustain tool, with 0 Aetherflow cost, and it will also guarantee a crit. You can also cast Consultation or Adloquium at no mana cost and guarantee crits on those as well. Generally, you will be using it in combination with deployment tactics if you're using a GCD to secure the strongest spread load possible, or you'll be using it on one of the 2 Aetherflow heals I mentioned. But regardless of what you do, get into the habit of planning around recitation as soon as possible, because you don't want to leave it on cooldown for long periods of time, because that skill is so good. One thing you'll notice is that up until this point in the video, I haven't mentioned your job gauge even once. This is because your fairy gauge interacts with literally one of your abilities, which in some circumstances can be very low impact for the group on the whole, because it is just a tank sustain tool primarily and is otherwise kind of pointless. Basically, every time you use an Aetherflow stack, you gain 10 on the gauge, up to a maximum of 100. At any time, via an OGCD, you can activate Fey Union, tethering the fairy to a target of choice. Fey Union is basically a single target regen with a 300 potency, and in the majority of cases, this is a pretty good tank sustain tool. You can also use it to provide a shot or 2 of HP to a non-tank player that is significantly lower than the others, before a big hit comes in to save you investing other resources. So amongst your free heals, you have 2 AoE regens, AoE shielding from Seraph, you have 2 AoE mitigations, numerous healing vamps and tools to keep a tank healthy. Pretty beefy kit all round if I'm honest. Then come your Aetherflow heals, Lustrate, Indom, Excog and Sacred Soil. Lustrate is something that honestly you will not end up using all that much. It is either a panic heal tool for recovery, or to fix when another player gets hit with something they shouldn't, or often on a tank it is a result of poor party planning. Don't be scared to use it, but it will be your least used Aetherflow heal by far once you are a very comfortable Scholar player. Sacred Soil places a circular field on the floor and provides both damage mitigation and a regen to all those within it. Sacred Soil and Sage's equivalent are, in my opinion, some of the most valuable healing cooldowns in the entire game. Providing both mitigation and passive healing is incredibly strong, and it lasting for 15 seconds with a 30-second cooldown is even wilder. You can literally have 50% uptime on this thing if you really want to, and it's good to make liberal use of this tool for raid wides and intense healing phases, and at any point where you don't have access to another regen either, this is absolutely a good stand-in. Indom is an AoE heal, and Excog is a single target tool which will place a 45-second buff on a chosen target. When they hit half HP or Excog times out, it gives them a huge shot of sustain in the form of an 800 potency heal. Indom and Excog are the 2 heals you can get for free via recitation. Lastly, you have your GCD heals. These include spells such as Consultation, your AoE shield, Physic, your single target heal that you very rarely use, and Adloquium, your single target shield. You also have 2 OGCDs that make use of these. Deployment Tactics and Emergency Tactics. They don't do anything on their own though. Emergency Tactics basically eats the shield of your next Adlo or Consultation and converts its potency into HP recovered. Basically, in terms of the way you would actually use it in practice, it sacrifices the shield from a Consultation for a stronger AoE heal when you need to top HP bars quickly right now. Deployment Tactics allows you to spread the galvanized component of an Adlo from one target to the rest of the party, providing a strong AoE shield to your allies. In fact, when this is buffed correctly, this is the strongest shield the game has. Consultation is typically used in situations where you need to protect against an incoming hit, otherwise the group will die, or in recovery or blind situations where you don't know what's coming next. It's strong and useful, but you do not want to become too reliant on it and use it for absolutely everything. It's MP intensive, and generally not very good play to do so. Lastly, you have Seraphism. Aside from the aforementioned AoE regen, it also has 5 million other features, including reducing your emergency tactics cooldown to 1, upgrading your Consultation and Adlo into stronger versions called Manifestation and Accession. Oh, and it also makes both of them instant cast as long as it's active. Whilst it seemed kind of low impact when we were talking about free heals, the pure strength, survivability and recoverability offered by this skill is absolutely unmatched when we don't factor in the DPS loss of using those healing GCDs. This is both an incredible progression tool, an amazing safety tool, and it will absolutely shine in high intensity healing situations. So these are all of your main tools. I know that Scholar has a lot of stuff, so it can sound a little overwhelming. So I have two more things to touch on before we move on. Firstly, Deployment Tactics is one of those unique Scholar abilities that no other job can properly replicate. It can be so incredibly strong with the right setup, able to invalidate mechanics or healing checks completely. Usually in harder fights, you plan the rest of your mitigation and heals around your spread Adlos. They are the foundation of your planning that everything else works around. When a problem mechanic, massive hit, or heal check appears, Deployment Tactics is your best friend. Because it spreads the Galvanize, it can be buffed, and Scholar certainly has a lot of abilities that buff it. Dissipation, Fey Illumination, Protraction, and Recitation forcing a crit can all combo with a Deployment Tactics shield to make it stronger, as well as tools from other players such as a mantra from a monk. Using a combination of these abilities on the party or initial shield target will strengthen the shield and the resulting spread by a massive margin, leading to these towering, almost full HP bar covering veils of mitigation that you sometimes see in clear videos. Whenever you plan a spread Adlo, you want to check which tools you or your party can provide that will buff it, and factor those in as a part of your plan as well. I would also recommend considering your target carefully. For example, if you have a warrior that isn't currently taking auto attacks, and they can use Thrill of Battle and Rampart, these two will buff the spread Adlo if you cast it on them. They use those, you throw your Protraction on them, and use your other tools, cast the Adlo, and spread it off of them to make it incredibly strong. Your aim, and a very important skill as a healer, is being able to remember when the next instance of incoming damage is, and roughly how hard it hits. This allows you to formulate a plan. You'll notice that in the long list of tools that Scholar has, many are very useful, but there aren't any that are like, press this to fill HP bars, or make this incoming hit go away, even with Deployment Tactics. This is because Scholar is actually all about combining two or more of these abilities at once to deal with any real incoming threat. And your goal is to learn about what works together for certain circumstances. For example, if there is a heavy movement mechanic that splits up the group, Spread Adlo and Expedient will do a fantastic job of helping the party fulfill that mechanic and be protected while doing so. And if there are heals in between, adding a Whispering Dawn or Fey Illumination to that will provide either passive regen or make those heals a little bit easier to get off. Multiple manageable raid wides about to go off? Sacred Soil and Summon Seraph will deal with it nicely, using the Constellation to shield each hit and the mitigation and regen from Soil to cover the rest and heal the group afterwards. Honestly, when it comes to Fey Blessing, I kind of use it as a throwaway cooldown due to its relative low value. If the raid needs to be topped and there is a decent chunk of time to do it, Whispering Dawn and Fey Blessing will do the trick. If I need to heal them fast, Indom and Fey Blessing combined will have it covered. Usually on its own, it's not quite strong enough to be particularly valuable, but combined with another of your tools or something from your co-healer, it can be a difference maker. A note on Expedient: my personal belief is that Expedient serves you better as a mitigation primarily, and a movement tool secondarily. Your goal is to double dip and gain value from both components, and a lot of the time, you will easily be able to. But using it during a section where there is no damage coming out just for movement, people can use their sprints instead. You want to use your tools effectively, ideally without overextending and burning them all at once. There is a very fine line to juggle here. A cooldown that sits available for extended periods of time is being wasted. It's doing nothing of value. So it's better to use it than to do nothing at all with it. But it's also not ideal to burn all of your powerful heals all at once, leaving you with nothing but GCDs for an upcoming healing section. Balance and foresight is absolutely key to good healing. One thing about Scholar that is a little weird is that their kit is just kind of clunky, and you learn to get used to it. What do I mean by that? Well, Summon Seraph locks you out of using Fey Union or Fey Blessing. Dissipation locks you out of all fairy heals altogether. You can only use Constellation under Seraph, which then means you can't use two of your other skills. Seraphism also can't be used under Dissipation, despite not really being a fairy ability. It adds an extra element of thought to when you use your cooldowns, and it's something to bear in mind. A big part of good Scholar gameplay revolves around your ability to effectively manage your Aetherflow stacks. to maximize both damage and group survivability at the same time. Your goal is to make every single stack count. You either get a super valuable heal from it, or you use it for damage, preferably under raid buffs. You should be using Aetherflow on cooldown, and in most cases doing the same with Dissipation. Exceptions exist, such as when you need access to the healing tools that Dissipation locks out. Remember, it is much better to use an Aetherflow heal than it is to use something like a Consultation in terms of damage. And Sacred Soil is one of the best general purpose healing cooldowns in the entire game, so you shouldn't be afraid in the slightest to use your stacks on heals. Recitation is, for like the 6 millionth time, one of the strongest tools in a Scholar's kit. In Dawntrail, it is a 60-second cooldown rather than the previous 90, and it allows you to use Indom or Excog with no Aetherflow cost associated, and they also guarantee a crit. This tool is also used for using a buffed spread Adlo. What you need to and what you want to know for now is that every minute you have access to one of your tools for free, and your goal is to make ample use of it, because not only is it really good, but this is the fuel that makes your Aetherflow economy healthy. As I mentioned before, you will get 12 stacks every 3 minutes, and the opener and setting that you use will depend on how I recommend using them. If you use the Dissipation first opener, which is the one that I recommended for the quote-unquote ideal case scenario, what you'll actually end up doing with the odd minute Aetherflows is holding on to all of those stacks unless you need them for healing, and then when the raid buffs come up, you will dump all of the stacks you have left over before going into your next Aetherflow. Your goal, essentially, is to keep them as long as possible, but have them all spent by the time Aetherflow or Dissipation comes back off cooldown. When Dissipation is coming back up off cooldown, you want to change your priorities a little bit. Because Dissipation alternates between buff windows and non-buff windows, in the non-buff windows, you want to Dissipation, burn all 3 stacks immediately, then Aetherflow should come back up off cooldown, and then you will want to press your Aetherflow, and those 3 stacks are the ones that you keep for your burst window. However, when it's the other way around and Dissipation is coming up with raid buffs, there are a few different things you can do. Firstly, you can dump your 3 Aetherflow stacks and then do your reopener just the way you would do a normal opener, which is Dissipation, burn 3 stacks, Aetherflow, burn 3 stacks. But an alternative you can do, and this requires you to hold the Dissipation to do so, is to actually get 9 stacks off in a burst window. Now, this is something you will only do when you know the actual fight duration, and you know this won't lose you an overall usage of Dissipation. What you end up doing here is you hold onto the 3 Aetherflow stacks and Dissipation for pot and raid buffs, and then you use your 3 Aetherflow stacks into Aetherflow, into 3 Aetherflow stacks, into Dissipation, into 3 Aetherflow stacks, and you can get a pretty nice burst with this, but obviously you only do this when you know that you're not losing something from doing it. This is kind of a niche case that you will only use occasionally, mainly in reclears. So just to summarize, your goal for general use Aetherflow is to save those 3 stacks as long as possible, because it is a damage gain to hold them all the way into raid buffs, but use them on healing as necessary, and to smartly figure out where your Dissipation fits into this and be careful about when you use it. Anything that gets left over into raid buffs I consider fair game, and I dump those on energy drain. We'll next talk about how to effectively fulfill the #1 rule of playing FF14 jobs: always be casting. Most fights have a bunch of different mechanics that either require precise positioning or for you to move a substantial distance in a short space of time. As a job with cast bars, that can be pretty tough to do without dropping casts. So you have a few tools and thought processes at your disposal that you want to ensure you make use of whilst in general play. Firstly is to plan in advance. Just like you're always looking for the next instance of incoming damage as a healer, you should also always be looking to the next mechanic and what position you'll need to be in for it. If you know you need to move to a specific side of the arena for a left-right cleave, you should pre-position yourself directly in the center, making it easy to dodge no matter what permutation crops up. If you need to head northwest to dodge a future AoE, you can slowly make your way there instead of needing to rush and potentially clipping or using GCDs on the way. You can also make use of slidecasting, and yes, I'm yoinking this footage from the White Mage guide because it's the exact same. If you watch here, you can see that near the end of each cast, where there's around 0.75 to 0.5 of a second left of the cast, I'm moving a little bit and then stopping as the cast completes, but my cast isn't cancelled by the movement I just made. That's slidecasting. So much of Final Fantasy XIV's mechanics revolve around positioning yourself in a certain spot at a certain time. When you don't have complete freedom of movement, you want to make the most of any window of opportunity possible to get there efficiently. This means taking advantage of both instance and slide casts to get yourself from spot to spot without losing uptime. I'd advise practicing this whenever you can, in roulettes, on a dummy, whatever, and get as consistent as you can because it will help you a lot. If you want a simple little tip to help you understand when your slide casting window opens more easily, I find this one to be very handy in teaching new players. If you take an emote and place it somewhere visible on your hotbar and just keep an eye on it while you're casting, you're going to notice that it grays out during the cast and then lights up again slightly before the cast ends. When it lights back up, you can slide cast without cancelling your GCD. This emote on your hotbar is the perfect set of slide casting training wheels. Use this as a reference point whilst practicing, and eventually, with comfort, you'll get a feeling of just how early you can slide cast and you'll end up not referring to it anymore at all. Healers also have a half GCD of movement after every single filler DPS GCD, which is Broil in the case of Scholar. This means that if you have a little foresight, you can generally get through all but the fastest movement sections without using any instance of a movement just by inching your way over there in between broils. If both of these fail you, you can opt to burn your instance as movement tools to extend the periods of time with which you can freely run around. Sometimes you can use your natural or even an early Biolysis refresh, or a swift cast if you have high confidence you won't need it for a raise in the next 40 seconds. Scholar is also in a fairly unique position in that they can use Ruin 2 at will to move freely whenever they want, as what is in the grand scheme of things, it is a minor DPS loss. You should make use of this liberally, especially in progression settings or mechanics you aren't comfy in yet, and then cut back on them as you gain in confidence. Consider your options. Do you have enough time to get to your position slowly? If not, what instance can you use to keep rolling your GCD while you make those fast movements? If it is an intense healing section as well, this might be a good time to use Seraphism, because not only does it make your AoE and single target heals instant GCD, providing you those additional GCDs of movement, it also aids in overall healing because you get the AoE regen. Of course, Scholar also has the very unique cooldown Expedience as well, and if there is damage coming out here, you may plan to use Expedience to make it easier on the entire party. As a healer, you will also be expected to raise. In Duty Finder or Party Finder scenarios, it's safe to assume that responsibility will fall on you, whereas in static or while playing with people you already know, it is a good idea to make a raise priority plan. As in, decide which healer or res caster will put out the first raise, ensuring nobody accidentally wastes their resources or overcaps. Your aim when resing is to pair it in most cases with Swiftcast. Because it has such a long cast time, hard casting that spell is a worst case scenario. In a situation that you don't have Swiftcast available and no one else in the party does, if your Swiftcast is 7 or below, it's honestly even better to just wait for it and then Swift the raise instead. This section will give you an introduction to creating a good plan for your heals in an encounter. As a note, I'm not really talking about spreadsheeting and such, just how to plan, as well as how to efficiently work with your co-healer in 8-man content. Healing on any job effectively is rarely a case of applying one heal as a solution to the problem of an instance of damage, but instead thinking about how you can pair your tools and the tools of your co-healer and even the rest of your party effectively. You always want to be thinking about a couple of things. How can I get this ability on cooldown as soon as possible in a useful way? Where are the maximum value usages for spread Adlo in this fight? Let's pin those down first, and then think about Seraphism. Can I get through this section using my free resources, or do I want to plan out an Aetherflow stack? Is what I'm doing safe and consistent? If not, should I add something like an Illumination or Sacred Soil to make it safer? What's my co-healer doing? Are they putting all their strongest heals in the same place as me, leaving a Stry for other parts of the fight? Can I shift something around to fix that problem? When it comes to Scholar, I consider deployment tactics and Seraphism to be your MVP abilities. Plan these out first, and if you're doing blind progression, lock them in to any pain points. These, when used effectively, are mechanic deleting abilities, and they can be used separately from one another, so your aim is to pin one or both of them to any parts of the fight that feel difficult to heal or you can't get through without investing a lot of GCD heals. Then, lesser things can be placed around that. Expedients, Summon Seraph, and your Fey Illuminations and Recitations. Finally, using regens and heals from your miscellaneous tools such as Whispering Dawn and Sacred Soil's regen to fill any gaps. Following the rule where your aim is to give the party enough effective HP as well as a little safety buffer to survive the next incoming attack or mechanic, Scholar can often let a lot of raid damages ride using Sacred Soil alone and then follow it up with either Whispering Dawn, Recitation Indom, or Fey Blessing to bring the party back up afterwards. Remember that you only want to overly rely on shielding via Consultation in 3 cases. Firstly, when people will or may die if you don't, and secondly, when you're not sure what's coming next or how hard it hits, and of course lastly in recovery situations. It sounds counterintuitive, but barrier healers are not supposed to be spamming barriers on everything. Your goal is to use the other tools primarily and fall back on those barriers as and when needed. It is a safety tool rather than your bread and butter. It would be like spamming Medica or Medica 2 constantly on a white mage, in that it technically works, but it's usually the worst way possible to deal with a problem. On top of your own tools, it is important to consider what your co-healer has access to, where their strengths and weaknesses lie, and what you are expecting them to use in any given situation. This is actually one of the reasons that many people say to become a better healer, it is valuable to learn other jobs and roles, because this applies to all roles. Seeing what mitigation, support, strengths and weaknesses other roles and other jobs have also allows you to more effectively plan out how to utilize them and what you can expect them to be able to do and not to do. Let's say you as a scholar are playing with an Astro. Astro has way more tools than you do for dealing with single target damage on a tank, so you can expect that they will bear the brunt of that responsibility, and you can probably peel back a couple of XCOGs as a result. You can likely offer that occasional XCOG and your Fey Union and expect your co-healer to deal with the tanks aside from that unless something goes wrong, because you know that they have access to a million tools to do just that. On the other side of the coin, you have a lot more in the damage reduction department, and you also have ample passive regens alongside that. So you can basically use your mitigation as a guarantee to have protection for every incoming hit, as well as either an AoE regen or group heal afterwards to cover the party when Earthly Star isn't up. As I mentioned, Spread Adlo will be the core of your planning, not just for you personally, but for your entire group mitigation. It's that key. So your Astro should be paying attention to when you have those planned. They might even ask about it when you are about to pull, and working around them is important. Let's say instead you're playing with a Sage. Double barrier is totally viable, so really don't worry at all if this ends up happening. Firstly, Kerachol and Sacred Soil equivalent abilities for the 2 jobs can be stacked, and it's so strong to do so, making use of both mitigation and regen effects. The Sage has stronger tank healing tools than you do, but through a mixture of Cardia, Soteria, Heimer, and your Fairy, auto attack should be covered pretty safely. This comp has an abundance of mitigation, with Spread Adlo being the core, and as a result high damage phases should be a cinch. What will require a little more planning and forethought is getting the raid healed up in between those instances of damage. You'll want to be a lot more aggressive with your usages of Whispering Dawn, Seraphism, and Fey Blessing, and you'll also want to be more trigger happy when it comes to using Recitation Indom or even just Indom to cover the gaps where the Sage doesn't have anything to help push the party to full HP for an incoming attack. You'll want to watch out for Numa, as this is the Sage cooldown which is the best out of all of your combined tools at topping HP bars, and plan your group healing around that. There may come a time where you need to use Emergency Tactics Sucker to make sure the party is fully healed if your synergy isn't quite on point. Bear in mind when you're playing 2 barrier healers is that your basic shields, aka Consultation and Eucrasian Prognosis 2, do not cleanly stack. There's a lot of nuance to this, but for general purposes that nuance actually doesn't matter too much. In most cases, either the strongest shield or the latest applied is the one that will stay on the party, and the other will go. For unique tools like Constellation or Holos, these will stack with no issue, as they are bespoke heals. In a pug situation, you can't communicate super effectively, so often you end up overhealing to account for this, or you need to pay a little more attention to the tendencies of your co-healer. But when you're both in a group together, it's much easier because you can form concrete plans from these that will be consistent and hopefully easy to remember. If you're not sure what tools your allies have, that's okay. Bear in mind your primary responsibility as a barrier healer is to put in the majority, but not all, of the work in providing ample mitigation and, if needed, shielding for incoming attacks, and supporting in topping HP bars via your regens and instants. I also want to teach you how to be a team player when it comes to actually using your GCD heals. We've discussed emergency heals and how you usually use them when you're running low on tools or are coming up on a particularly difficult section, or when you've failed to plan properly. But there is another situation in which you'll use them. This is when, in doing so, you will gain another player in the party more damage than that which you lose. Your personal damage is less important than the overall group damage, and if you think otherwise, you're wrong. So let me use that same example as before. You're with that Sage co-healer and you have both exhausted your available free tools, and there's a hit coming in. You either need to finish topping the raid via a consultation, or the Sage will need to use a Eucrasian prognosis. Either of these tools will fix the problem and put the group in a healthy position for that next hit. They are equally fit for purpose. In this case, you're the guy who should do the heal. The group is losing either a Broil 4 or a Dosis, and at level 100, the Dosis does a lot more damage. It's much better to think of these heals in terms of what the group gains or loses rather than what you yourself gain or lose. After all, damage on boss from the whole party is what gets you to a clear. But like I said, it's not just you and your co-healer that can deal with incoming damage. The entire party has mitigation, healing, and shielding tools. Warriors can shield and heal the party with Shake It Off and lower incoming damage with Reprisal. Monks can increase HP received by healing actions as well as lowering incoming damage. Every single player in the party has at least something that can be applied to aid in keeping the party alive, and they should be doing it. Once again, in pugs, you just kind of have to see what happens and hope they're playing correctly, but in a group, you as a healer kind of have the secondary responsibility of directing traffic in terms of where you'd like that extra mitigation to be used. I don't want to direct you too much with hard rules, because I think the most fun component of healing is creating a healing plan yourself and seeing it all come together, especially in prog. So my recommendation is to take these pieces of advice and thought processes and try to apply them yourself, creating something bespoke and feeling rewarded when you get it right. If you thought of all of these things while you're planning mitigation, and you're happy that what you're doing satisfies most, if not all of these criteria, then you probably are doing it right. One thing to touch on here is that some healers like to make spreadsheets when planning their heals on Nit, and if you're attempting to play super optimally, it can absolutely be a useful thing to do. It's not something I personally make use of most of the time, but should your group want to, it is definitely an asset worth pursuing. Sometimes, however, things do not go to plan. No matter what situation you're in, be it progression or reclears, you are likely to run into a situation where you either need to come in immediately having received a revive and triage a less than ideal scenario, or recover party deaths to allow the group to continue the pull. Let's talk about how I break these situations down in my head into simple steps, and follow them one by one. By doing so, and doing so quickly, you can save so many pulls from immediate failure. I think it's good to get into the habit of trying to save pulls in progression, even if they will result in an enrage later, because recovery is an insanely useful skill to practice, and allowing the group another attempt on problem mechanics is really valuable as well. Firstly, think about what comes next. Is it damage to the party, or is it a mechanic? This will guide you as to how you prioritize. If it's a mechanic, check who else is dead. Do you need those guys? Think ahead to what's coming next, the next raid wide, buster, mechanic. Who needs to be alive to get through that? Get them up immediately, they are your highest priority. Utilize Swiftcast if you can, and if you don't have it, resort to hardcasting if you have to. Then, get up other people who can aid in the recovery process. Healers and other jobs with arrays such as Red Mage and Summoner are top priority. Then the tanks, and then finally, the non-caster DPS are usually last. If it's damage, instead of making reviving your priority, instead focus on healing and mitigating the raid for the incoming hit. That is assuming it isn't a split damage that will make you take more with less people alive. Make sure that the party has enough HP to survive the hit, preferably topped. And if one of the dead players is one that usually places mitigation on the mechanic, try to give something a little extra from yourself to help supplement the group's safety. As a scholar, this usually means a shield, sacred soil, or a mitigation like expedient should it be available, or realistically a combination of multiple. You can also throw up a fairy tether or excog to give the tank more survivability so that you can ignore them whilst you get to rezzing. Next up is to check your mana situation. Firstly, can you use lucid dreaming? Do you have enough mana to deal with this situation? If you don't or you're not sure, mana potion if it's available to give yourself an extra 1.8k MP buffer. Side note, you should definitely take mana potions with you if you're doing raid on a healer. This is especially important if you've just res. One thing to understand throughout all of this is what your party is going to be doing to help and what they can be doing to help. Recovery, whilst definitely has a heavy burden on the healers, is the responsibility of everyone. Tanks can put their targetable mitigation on players to help out. Paladin can do spot healing with a few clutch clemencies. Red Mage and Summoner can help with reses, and players can use their self-sustain whenever possible to make things a little easier on the healers. If you're in a recovery scenario as a healer and your Summoner or Red Mage is up, it should be an expectation that they'll be working on the reses so you can focus on triage for the party while they do. If they're dead on the floor, focus them and the other healer first so that you have more active reses to get the rest of the raid help. To summarize, in a recovery situation, you want to think, who do I need to res first? How quickly do I need to top the raid? What should I expect the rest of my party to do to help? What extra cooldowns can I dump here and now to ensure a nice and comfortable recovery? How's my MP? In these cases, you often ditch the idea of GCD efficient healing for a handful of seconds because it is just the easiest path to getting the group healthy again if you use GCDs as well. But once everybody is up, healthy, and you have about 3k mana in the bank, you can resume gameplay as usual and hopefully see progression further into the fight. If you yourself have died, you have a few considerations to make. Don't immediately accept res without thinking. If you immediately die after rezzing, it's your own fault. Many new players instantly fall into the trap of taking a raise, trying to heal themselves, and then they end up dying to unavoidable damage directly afterwards. You get the Transcendent buff when you come back up, which, as long as you don't use an action, allows you to be immune to almost every incoming hit in the game for 5 seconds. Use this to immunity an upcoming raid damage or mechanic, and then heal yourself and the party afterwards. It's important to note that I said use an action. You can still move safely. I also recommend super ethering as soon as your Transcendent buff drops if you can, making your recovery healing much more lenient and safe. You also need to make sure to summon your fairy once more as a matter of the highest priority. Healers can also use Lv100 to recover runs, and this is an excellent progression and recovery tool. There's not much point in covering nice safe Lv100s because they're obvious, but let me give you a fringe use case for healer LB that is very useful. Firstly, if you're one of the last remaining players, actually the less survivors the better, and a mechanic is coming in that will spell your doom, wait until a few seconds before it goes off, and then hit the healer Lv100 to flip the board. Anybody dead will be raised, surviving past the point of that mechanic hitting, and anybody alive at the time, including you, will die. In a situation where 6 were dead and 2 were alive or similar, such as in this clip where I'm the only guy left, this is a big play, and the other healer can quickly res you, and you can proceed to stabilize the run safely. For reference, we cleared this pull. You can also use raises in much the same way, accepting a raise right before a mechanic resolves, allowing you to avoid its effect entirely and survive past it. This is referred to as res cheesing usually, and it can be incredibly powerful. In dungeons, healing on Scholar is honestly really fun. In terms of healing, you can Adlo the tank between pulls, and whenever deployment tactics is available, also use one on yourself. When you get into the pull after the tank shield breaks, use deployment tactics on yourself to spread your Adlo back across to the tank, offering them more mitigation for free. Aside from that, I like to use Sacred Soil as default in every single trash pull as soon as they've been moved to their final position, and to prioritize using Recitation on Excogs for the tank on cooldown. don't be afraid to use your AoE tool specifically for the tank. In fact, that's actually your goal for the most part. On top of these tools, throw out another 1 or 2 of your free tools and slowly cycle them. For example, you could use Whispering Dawn and Expedient, then Seraph, then Fey Union, then Seraphism, and Fey Blessing. I personally like to cycle Fey Union every second pull, letting Fairy gauge accrue, then using it on the second pull, the fourth, and so on. And I use it after Excog and Soil, right at the start of the pull to keep the tank healthy for longer whilst I freely DPS. When the Excog procs, I start throwing out my other tools. I use Seraph in place of Fey Union on the odd pulls. If the pull goes on for too long, you can also use Adlo or burn Aetherflow stacks on Lustrates for the tank in order to give them triage if they drop too low. But when damage is average or above, your mitigation and passive healing tools alone should be enough to do the vast majority of the work for you. I also want to make a note that you can move whilst using Seraphism, so it can be a great way of putting solo shields on the tank in between pulls, carrying over that regen as you settle and start AoEing. You generally want to use Dissipation nearer the tail end of pulls if you can, and of course, ideally coming into pulls where you're not planning to use Seraphism on the next pull. Dissipation buffs your next pre-pull Adlo, gives you 3 Aetherflow stacks, and helps burn through that time when your Fairy is away, hindering your heals, whilst there aren't enemies hitting the tank or the next group is still being packed. I like to pair Dissipation with pulls where I will be using deployment tactics. For damage, put Biolysis on as many enemies as possible whilst the tank is still pulling and positioning, then once they're together, begin spamming Art of War 2 while you set up your mitigation tools. Then make sure to get off Chain Stratagem. You want to use it on trash packs as well for 2 reasons. Firstly, you want to keep it in line with the rest of the party buffs, and secondly, Painful Impaction is your strongest hit, and it's an AoE dot without drop-off. This skill is insane for killing mobs. I hope some of these tips were useful. You may have some pieces of knowledge for Scholar of your own that you'd like to contribute, especially because I'm sure I forgot something, even though this video is almost an hour long. If so, please, I'd love to hear from you in the comments section. I think one thing that's important to say is you can take in all this advice, and a lot of it is definitely worth bearing in mind, but there is no substitute for actual practice. The best thing you can possibly do is bear in mind a few of these sections that seem salient to you, apply them, and practice on them, and then slowly over time expand on the parts of Scholar's gameplay that you aren't too confident on. Play lots of content, hard, easy, and everything in between, and always analyze your performance afterwards. Not from the perspective of did you do good or bad, but from the perspective of taking notes of things to improve for the next time. Then, over time and effort, you will absolutely make a fantastic Scholar that any party would be glad to have. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.